Webinar starts.
Hello everyone.
Hello.
I'm Rob Whiteman, Chief Executive of CIPFA. Welcome to this webinar on recovery and reform after COVID-19. It's very nice to see you all. It's a strange existence, isn't it? We're all on these video conferences all day. When I bought this place, I didn't pay any attention to the box room, and now I spend my life in it. I hope you're all having a good experience though. We've got a good hour lined up, which we hope you enjoy. I'm going to say a few words in a moment, then we're going to hear from Ewan King, the Deputy Chief Exec at SCIE, then from Terry Neves, a former Section 151 officer. We're very pleased that Duncan Sharkey, the MD from Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, is joining us. Then we're going to hear Maggie Kenny from the Chief Exec of Peopletoo, and Colin Foster, the Director of Children's Services at Bedford. So we've got a lot to fit in the hour. Just by means of brief introduction, CIPFA, SCIE and Peopletoo have been keen to come together for this webinar. We're all practitioner-based organisations, and we want to be able to make sure that social care is absolutely at the forefront of what we can now do in terms of taking forward the very significant pressures that occur in this area, and of course occur more widely too. So we'll have the speakers. There'll be an opportunity to ask questions. Do put them in the chat room as you go along, and we can ask questions at the end of every speaker, and also we can come together at the end to finish up and have some questions too. So with much ado, we'll go onto our first speaker, please. Ewan, are you there and ready to address us?
Yes, I am. And big apologies for arriving late there. It's literally because my 3-year-old would not leave the room. So this is the realities of doing a webinar at home. Thank you, Rob. Yeah, I'm Ewan King from the Social Care Institute for Excellence. I'm just going to kick off with a bit of a discussion about commissioning, which of course is very relevant to the leadership of finances and local authority. I'm just going to highlight some findings that have emerged recently from work we've been doing for the Department of Health and Social Care to support the sector in recovering from COVID. So we've been producing a series of tools and guides to support commissioners with the immediate crisis that they face, but also trying to help them move out of the crisis and beyond. So my first slide really is about some of the positive activities, contributions that have been made by commissioners over recent months. We've spoken to over 50 commissioners, and actually we've been really pleased to see so many good things going on in what has been a really very difficult time for the sector. So I'm just going to highlight some of those really positive developments briefly to you now. So I think we found that it's absolutely crucial that commissioners talk regularly, proactively, and very often with their providers, trying to identify issues that arise, trying to preempt issues that are arising, and providing advice and support in many different ways. In addition, providing practical support to struggling providers, and many providers have been struggling, has been a crucial role of commissioners, providing channels to trusted supplies, PPE, making sure that training and even consultancy support is available to some of the organisations that have struggled in particular during this crisis. Helping also to combat supply and quality and cost issues that have arisen during the last 3 months. Being a real channel to advice and support, connecting people to advice in other parts of the sector, including the NHS as well. Recruitment has obviously been a very big concern for social care providers. Commissioners have actually stepped in here trying to help them access fast-track recruitment programs, access staff and resources from elsewhere in a local authority who can come in and help. Financial support has clearly underpinned all of this, making sure that payments are made quickly, contracts are quickly established and signed off, that red tape is reduced as much as possible. And this is really something that I think commissioners would recognise as being a really important element of their work and their job at the moment. And it's something that we need to build on as we look to the future of commissioning. Should we really go back to some of the ways we've worked in the past, or can we make processes and payments simpler in the future? And finally, that thorny issue of hospital discharge. I think this has been a really very difficult aspect of the COVID crisis, but we have seen, and we have spoken to local authorities that have done really good things in this area, making sure that they are thinking ahead about where they can deploy staff to support people to live independently at home, how they can use block booking, for example, of beds, step-down beds, to help the flow of people through hospitals. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the second slide for me, the final slide for me, is about the future of commissioning. And we've been talking to, as I've said, a number of leaders across the sector and also commissioners about where we go next. And I think there are 5 areas, 5 themes that seem to emerge very strongly. First of all, we need to keep driving towards a more place-based approach, devolving money and decision-making down to the neighbourhood level, so that people, services and providers are very close to decision-making. And also redoubling our efforts to join up commissioning with the NHS and with other statutory services locally. I think we need to think in terms of community assets and strengths. So asset-based approaches to commissioning, I think, will rise in prominence. How can we design and commission services which build on the skills, capabilities and resources that reside within communities? I think we've all been impressed with the willingness and appetite for local people to get involved in helping one another. How can we bottle that and galvanise that in the future? I think commissioning needs to be much more co-produced. I think the very best services are those which reflect the needs and wishes of local people. How can we involve people who live with lived experience earlier and throughout the process of commissioning services? And data and risk. I think we could do much more in local authorities to harness the new technologies that we have at our disposal, to use big data to analyse future trends. And I know that Peopletoo are very strong on projecting demand for services, so that we can target services much more appropriately to those who need them most and to the places which need them most. And finally, outcome focused. I think we've continued for too long now to be measuring performance in relation to time and task and hours used, whereas actually we need to measure what matters to people. And that means slowly shifting towards measures like well-being, keeping people independent, and keeping people connected, because actually over the longer term that will reduce demand and cost. So that's really it from me. Happy to take questions later, and the guidance is on the SCIE website for commissioners. Thank you, Rob.
Well, thanks very much, Ewan. That was really interesting. Steve, are there any questions for Ewan at this stage?
Not particularly for Ewan, I don't think, but a couple of people, Colin and Phil, have asked whether the slides will be available. Well, the slides and the recording of this, what we're doing right now, will be available. It's usually within the week on the page that delegates signed up to, or we'll be emailing anybody if you signed up on that page within the week. But I've emailed everyone back that information who's on the list. We have had one question actually that has sent in via email. So do send your other questions in the questions tab, folks. But Craig has asked, it is widely accepted that the mutual aid and voluntary sector will have a huge role in the COVID-19 response, particularly in terms of mental health. They are sectors that have not been included largely when trying to integrate services. How does the panel feel we can address this, and how urgent is this, and is it being done? So you can either answer that now or later, but those types of questions, folks, do send them.
Ewan, if you want to say a word or two about that, and then other panelists can weave that in when they speak. Any thoughts on that point about the voluntary and community sector, Ewan?
Yeah, so I think the places that we've spoken to that are progressing most furthest with commissioning are adopting, as I've said, that place-based approach and trying to involve the voluntary sector much earlier in conversations about how the local authority is going to spend its money and how the NHS is going to spend its money. So I think they've got to be at the top table at a local level in deciding what priorities are there for the local community and how we fund those priorities. So there's something about involving them earlier and not keeping them at an arm's length. I think we've got to break down that commissioning provider split, which sometimes unnecessarily gets in the way. Mental health absolutely should be part of local commissioning. and more central to decision making.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. So Terry, it's a pleasure to introduce you. And you know, one of the flavours of this seminar today is that, you know, frontline practitioners and finance practitioners need to be joined at the hip. There's no point having sort of tensions between us. We're all in the same boat, and it's about helping the organisation and the sector. And Terry, your thoughts on this will be really welcome.
Thank you, Rob, and good morning, everyone. I think really that's particularly important because when you look at the 80-20 rule, we're almost reaching a point where about 80% of councils' budgets are being spent on social care for children and adults. That means that firstly, there's quite a big imbalance between the people who are receiving the results of council spending and those people who are paying for it. But also it means that the viability of council budgets really rise and fall on social care. Just moving on, of course, there's then perhaps the £200,000 placement decision. I don't think we've been at a time before where single spending decisions have had such an impact financially. And I think to some extent, finance professionals, financial regulations, all of those things are taking a while to come up to date with that and are perhaps out of step with that. Other aspects, well, in terms of outsourcing, a lot of people might be spending your money. And I suppose the obvious question there is, are they making the decisions that you would make? And how can you be reassured that they are making those decisions that you would make as well, and the impact in turn that has on the financial viability for the council? The next one is an interesting one around Ofsted inspections, CQC inspections. Can you afford to be excellent? You know, the cost of being excellent is quite substantial. On the other side, the cost of not being good is probably also substantial in terms of the recovery costs involved. And to make matters even worse, with raising standards, the old good is perhaps becoming the new requires improvement. So there are big pressures around meeting all those costs of rising standards as well. I've touched on it before, but the finance skills of finance staff really need to become more in step with the particular financial risks that social care is placing. And you know, the point you made right at the start around the need for finance professionals and social care practitioners to work closely together is so vitally important if councils are actually going to exert the right level of control over their budgets and actually keep within budget as well. And finally, on the bottom of the slide, I think there are real issues around the credibility of the council tax. You know, with so much of the budget being spent on social care, the reality of the situation is that councils are having to cut services that are delivered to the majority of their residents to protect services for the minority of their residents. Now, that is a very, very hard thing to deliver politically and can cause very difficult problems in terms of deciding and agreeing a budget as well. So if I could have perhaps the next slide then, please. I'll just come on to that. As a former Section 151 officer, there are two key really important statutory things that I had to do. Well, one I had to do, one I hoped I'd never do. The first thing I had to do every time the budget was set was to make a Section 25 statement. And that statement talked about whether the estimates within the budget were reasonable and accurate, and whether reserves were adequate to support the budget as well. In previous years, if you turn the clock back some while, that didn't really take very long. Now, it is a huge decision for directors of finance to take, particularly around COVID-19, because who can tell how big the impact will be on council budgets or for how long that impact will last. And that really goes to the heart of the decision on the Section 25 statement that chief finance officers will be making. And also, from a deeply personal point of view, it goes to their credibility. because if they get that decision wrong, then their credibility will not be enhanced, it will be weakened. The other key thing that I mentioned is the Section 114 report, something that a Director of Finance, Section 151 officer would hope never, ever, ever to have to issue. And something that really was incredibly uncommon. You wouldn't even have one a year. Now, I think it's really the case that many Section 151 officers will be starting to think about Section 114 because of COVID-19, not just because of social care, but also because of the impact it's having on income for councils as well. And I know CIPFA did quite a detailed survey looking into that. And I think that's going to be a big decision for an increasingly big decision for Section 151 officers. The other thing, of course, is that when those Section 114 reports were issued previously, the MHCLG could cope with one in a blue moon. I don't know that they can cope with 20, 30, 40 at one time. And that's another issue to think about. So that's really what I wanted to cover today. More than happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Thanks very much indeed. Steve, do we have any questions for Terry?
We certainly do have questions coming in. We've done other webinars before where we've been sort of eking it out a bit, but Julie, Mike, Iris,
very good.
Ian and Mark have all asked questions. Let me just grab one here. Let's go for Iris's question. Many care providers experience is that COVID funding was not fast-tracked to them, putting them under exceptional pressure. How can we move beyond local variations and interpretations of good funding stroke commissioning practice? Shall I read one more question and then you can perhaps answer that? But they're coming in thick and fast, so thanks for this. Julie says, commissioning outcomes were introduced in 2004. Why did commissioners embrace it? So 2 questions to perhaps kick off this a little bit with, if that's okay.
Terry, any comments on those? Really, these are questions about, we welcome localism, but how do we make sure that there's strong practice everywhere on commissioning and the financial outcomes that are taking place? Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think it's about that, but I think it also is about the fact that councils are incredibly reliant when something goes wrong on external funding, and you know they can't manage something as impactful as COVID-19 within the funds they have, and I think it then depends on how quickly that funding gets to them and how certain it is. And if there are delays, then there are severe problems. And I think it goes back to the 80-20 rule. It goes back to, you know, sort of how local generally are these services, and how they're being met from local money, basically, to some extent.
Thanks very much. Maybe I can just add a comment of my own here as the Section 114 issue was mentioned. CIPFA's view is that it would be really counterproductive and quite difficult for a council to issue a 114 notice at the moment, because a 114 notice initiates a spending freeze for all but emergency services. And the idea that we would have to have discussions within councils about what constitutes emergency services and what doesn't. Very often we use the terminology of statutory and non-statutory services around does a member of the public have a right to this service, rather than the council just have a duty to provide it. The shielding programme in place is arguably not on a statutory footing and not a statutory service, but is very much an emergency provision that's being given. And the idea that every council would have to be checking with its lawyers, what do we freeze and what don't we freeze? However, the Section 114 remains on the statute book and is a requirement. So CIPFA's advice to councils at the moment is to make the Cabinet aware that the council is in a 114 position, but not to serve the notice to publicly freeze expenditure, and to have a conversation with government about, are there any emergency measures or help you can give us to avoid a 114 notice. That guidance will remain in place for the coming months, but I think probably the tough time for councils is going to be the autumn budget making in preparation for next year. And just one more point, a 114 notice applies to all financial years, not only the present year. So I think what we're likely to see in the autumn is less about, well, maybe we'll see them about this year, but the difficult decision for 114 officers, as Terry has just set out, is does next year or the year after look materially imbalanced? Because if it does, the 114 officer has a personal duty in law on themselves to issue a notice to freeze expenditure until that issue is resolved, even if it's a future financial year. Anyway, with that cheerful thought, we'll move on to our next speaker, Duncan Sharkey. Great to see you today, Duncan. I really appreciate taking time out of your what must be a very busy life running a unitary as you are. We look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thanks very much, Rob. I got asked really to pick up, I think, on what Terry had brought to life to us in his presentation about what that means for us. And I think the key thing really for me was, what was that link between recovery, COVID, and the financial risk that we've been asked to talk about? Because COVID's changed our systems. It's changed how we think, it's changed how we work, it's changed what we need to respond to. But I think actually the response we're all going to have to make is to do the stuff we've been talking about for years, quicker, better, and really focus on it, because that's the solutions. The solutions to some of the things we've been talking about haven't changed particularly. So for my council, we really need to make sure we've linked in the finance and the social care colleagues, so it's one team with one objective. Because Terry mentioned 80-20. In my organisation, adults and children spend is about 70% of our net budget. With instability in the provider market, with increased costs of what we're delivering ourselves, with increased costs arising from how we have to deliver things ourselves changing quite substantially, and significantly, I know Maggie will touch on it, but potentially shifting demand patterns. And we expect to see, at least in the medium term, more significant needs from people coming into adult social care who have suffered from COVID directly, have particular needs that need supporting as well. What we can't handle are any more financial shocks. We're already significantly over budget because of COVID this year. There'll be knock-on implications in future years that we can't quantify in any detail at this point in time. What we need to know is that we are getting our figures right as best we can. So the key thing we need to make sure we're doing is looking at projecting costs and income, I would say, because most councils have got somewhere we're projecting costs better. I've not seen many councils being great at projecting income as yet. We need to make sure that we're really looking at that wider data set, understanding the trends, making projections, and then continually challenging those projections. So we got the right figures in the budget. I've got a huge amount of faith in colleagues across adults and social care, not just with my council, but in the wider local government family. We can deliver good services. What we can't keep doing, though, is being in an emergency position where we got to keep changing and chopping things halfway through the year because the budgets weren't right to start with. Even with difficult times financially, if you give most councils 3 or 4 years to actually resolve a problem, we can sort the finances out. What we really struggle with is when someone gives us 3 months to resolve the problem, because that's emergency action and that affects all the other services that we're talking about. So second point I want to really make was it's about reshaping the finance thinking. I'm trying to work really hard with my colleagues, and I've got some great people working on this in our organisation now, realising that actual finance management for adults and children is not about process. It's about a leadership role. It's about helping managers across adults and children's services understand what's actually driving their budgets. What are the things that are making a difference day to day and making things change? And really supporting them with that thinking that's already been touched on by you, and quite rightly, about how do we move to more place-based commissioning? How do we use better community assets? COVID's given some really good clues about how we've done that in an emergency situation. How do we do that sustainably in a non-emergency situation? So we actually build the assets up and make sure that the support's there for people consistently, because what we can't have is support that dips in and dips out. So we really need to make sure that's the whole team focused on how we take that forward. To me, that leads us straight into transformation. So discussion we've all been having before, it shouldn't be work that's new to anyone. But one of the ways we know we can manage financial risk is about that increased focus on prevention. And that does mean we're going to have to take a risk on transformation. You know, we can't say transformation's ever nailed on. We have to work at it to deliver it. But if we're not prepared to take risks on transformation, then we're going to have to cope with the financial risks of the budget. If we can manage the risk on transformation, we can minimize the financial risks of the budget, hopefully. But that's just going to be to keep doing what we're already doing quite well in a number of councils, about that short, sharp intervention earlier on in the process that gives us lower cost intervention to stabilise cases and means it's better for people immediately, and it's better for us as organisations in understanding demand going forward. That ties us into good decision making. I don't think I need to say a huge amount more about that. It's obvious. Terry touched on the £200,000 decisions for commissioning that we can sometimes be taking. You know, those sizes of the decisions are material considerations for virtually every other service, but they're unfortunately becoming more and more common in our adults and children's services. Those are the sorts of decisions we're making on a case-by-case basis. And if we're doing that, the financial guidance has got to be really solid. And that's across the entire system. Ewan touched on the fact that other people are making commissioning decisions that affect our market. They affect what we've got to pay. They affect how we work. So we need to make really sure that we're all working to the same financial guidance across the piece, and it stacks up to get really good outcomes for people. And the last thing I just want to touch on, Rob, which I don't think many of us are doing well, is making sure we've got the risk registers that understands the commerciality of our position as councils. We're really good, I would suggest, at risk registers around people, around safeguarding, around health and safety, around whatever it may be. But some of the things we're doing now are moving councils very specifically away from being pure commissioners and trying to transfer risk onto other people, the providers, etc., to actually being part of that market ourselves. Whether that's because we're standing up and supporting providers, whether that's because we're taking over services that other people are handing back to us, whether that's because we're putting more constraints, more requirements on money we are paying out as part of the contract. We're moving our position on that risk curve of commerciality. And I just think we need to all have a discussion about where do we want to be on that risk curve? How much do we want to be in the market as opposed to just shaping it or buying from it? How much are we actually prepared to make that market and put ourselves on the line? There's no right and wrong answer to that. But what I wouldn't want to find is that my council turned out to be in a very risky position without taking a decision to get there ourselves. I'll stop at that.
No, thanks. It's a really interesting point, Duncan. I think something I say a lot to people is remember that councils can operate with more commercial freedom than a commercial organisation, and that in itself poses risks. So if I run a commercial organisation and I want some money, investors will be all over me, whether it's through share capital or a bank, and they'll say, what's your prospectus, what's your team like, what's your governance, who have you got monitoring you? And actually, I don't get the money or I don't get to act unless I persuade everyone through that market mechanism that I'll deliver it. Actually, we operate with a lot more commercial freedom than that, and unless we deliberately put governance in place to ask all those challenging questions, actually, we might find that we're taking more risk than we understand. I think
exactly
that's the point you're making, isn't it?
Yeah.
Steve, any questions for Duncan?
Yeah, I'm going to perhaps tell you what Colin, Lynn and Andy have said. Colin says in children's social care, we're experiencing not an increase in demand, but an increase in unit costs, plus 15% in the last 6 months. The increase in costs comes quicker and sharper than return on transformation investment. So perhaps answer that one if you can. Also, Lynn says, what is your view on effective prevention? Oh, hang on, the screen went there. On effective prevention and demand management in terms of adult social care, particularly with pressures on growing age-based demand. And then Andy's pointed out that the bottom of the slides is missing. Andy, sorry about that. What we'll do is I've said to everyone we're going to send the slides out at some point within the week. So if you can't quite see the bottom of that slide, we will get that information to you. But yeah, if you want to answer those questions and then come back to me later, plenty are coming in, Rob.
So Duncan, something prevention. How do we get a better focus on prevention? And the very real question about, actually, we worry about the gateway, and and sort of eligibility criteria, but at the moment unit costs look like they're going up as well. Thoughts on both those things?
Yeah, so I don't think I have a solid answer on either of those. If I did, I'd probably be sat somewhere in a venture capital firm. But the bottom line on unit costs are we have to continue to work with the market, with the people commissioning the market, to manage and control that market as best we can. We need to be really clear about our commissioning behaviour across the system, not just about our individual organisations. And that means all the way from individual practice on individual cases, making sure we've got the real expertise of commissioning that some people hold, and we're making really solid commissioning decisions. If unit costs are going up, that's about supply and demand and people's profitability and the costs that they're carrying. So we know in adults we've got some money to support providers in terms of their increased costs. All right, it's a one-off, but we need to look at that as we're going forward. We need to try and understand how that is going to play out into the longer term, because assuming COVID is with us for a long time, then what we would expect to see is it'll be efficiencies driven in as things become less an emergency response and more of just a new operating practice. So we have to understand what that really should look like and make sure we're being really clear with providers who are our partners, not our opposition, I would always say, to make sure we're giving them enough money to operate properly and fairly, but we're actually managing the market so we're not pushing costs into commission we don't need to see. I would agree entirely in children's about unit costs right now being a pressure. What I'm worried about, I have to say, is that we're going to see a spike as well in demand when we have a large number of young people back in school for the first time, potentially in a long time in September, and someone says, so what did you do during lockdown? And we find out. That could well be an issue, but I'll let Colin cover that one because that's much more his bailiwick than mine. In terms of the second point, Rob, just remind me.
Prevention.
Yes, prevention. Prevention in children's, I think we've got a much better handle on, I would suggest, as a system, because we can actually try and work hard to prevent cases coming through the gateway, through the doorway at all. Preventions in adults is much more difficult to understand, because if we talk in particular about age-related, cases, then eventually people will come to us at some point. What we need to try and understand is what are the expensive parts of our system. So expensive parts of our system are when placements break down, when we have to make large changes in placements, keep changing people's arrangements. Actually, can we do better work up front to try and make sure we can give people as much stability as possible, because that allows us to make long-term commissioning decisions with our partners. Right now, I suspect if there are providers on the line, what they really want to make sure is they know they've got their places full for a period of time, because that's what gives them the income stability. If we've made really good assessments, done really good work up front with people and looked at, I hesitate to say lifetime needs, because I don't necessarily mean that in that sense, but looked at as far as we can, the needs of the client we're working with, we can make better commissioning decisions, which would hopefully work better for providers and manage costs in a different way. And very much, for us, that's been about looking at what is that balance, particularly around domiciliary care. How much support can we put in to keep people independent or as independent as possible in their own home before we talk about placements. And I would just make a plea for the fact we know there's a huge amount of care cost tied up in people who we're looking after for a very long time. And we need to make sure we've got a real focus there as well about giving people with learning disability, for example, a home for themselves for life if we can, because again, there's a huge amount of costs in transitions and continually changing packages there. So the more we can look ahead, the more we can predict what people are going to need, I think the more we've got an opportunity of managing costs in the long term with the market working with us.
No, really, really rich, insightful answers. Thanks very much indeed. I'll make sure we've got time at the end for some of these questions to be asked of the panel in general as well. So we'll move on. Maggie Kenny, Chief Exec of Peopletoo. We look forward to hearing your thoughts, Maggie. Hi.
Hi, Rob. What I wanted to cover today is something that is playing out as a real challenge for the sector around hidden demand, and it links very much with everything that Ewan, Terry, Duncan, and yourself, Rob, have covered so far in terms of understanding what the financial envelope that is required to manage some of this hidden demand but also what services we are going and what support we are going to have to commission to mitigate some of this demand, and it may look different to what we currently commission. I think, you know, we note from recent media publications that referrals into social care during lockdown have fallen in some places, particularly children's social care, by as much as half. And whilst what we're kind of calling a lag in demand is easier to model, as we know it is actually temporary and it will come through the system, and we can start to map that out, what that does to resources, I think it's the hidden demand that we are struggling to quantify, and that we probably cannot quantify right now, that is likely to have the biggest impact on already stretched social care budgets. So I just wanted to talk today a bit about what we're starting to do, working with clients like Colin from Bedford Borough Council, to try and think about how we can start to quantify some of this. So, I mean, what we already know is basically the risk of domestic violence is greater during lockdown, with victims being in close proximity. We're getting very mixed messages. Some local authorities have seen a rise during lockdown. Some have actually seen a reduction in referrals. And some of that is to do with accessibility. So how accessible services are for victims during lockdown, whether they're living in urban or rural areas. The economic downturn we know is going to hit, and we know that more families will be living in poverty. And we already know from the Children's Commissioner that the local authorities that are up in the top quartile around poverty and children and living in poverty. And what is this downturn going to have in terms of the impact on that and the risk of homelessness, particularly when the 3-month ban on eviction is lifted. Mental health is going to be a huge problem, but particularly probably those who would not meet statutory thresholds, and how we support those to stop that kind of like shift over into more complex mental health issues. That leads on to increased triggers of anxiety, stress, depression, parents, carers already on the edge with history of substance misuse. And we know from some of the DCSs that we're working with that they are already kind of seeing families not known to social care presenting with children who are suffering from serious neglect and physical abuse. Another one that is really interesting, again, is the complex cases of neglect or safeguarding triggers where families have taken on a carer role. We know that there are families who have, when actually the COVID struck and lockdown was enforced, that they actually removed them from their supported living environments, took them back into the family home. We also know that there are cases, you know, lots of cases where domiciliary care packages have been suspended and carers have taken on that role. We do not yet know what the impact of that has been. And then obviously the closure of universal services. So where we would have got some triggers from those services, there's been reductions in health visiting, early help services, and also as well the limited access to extended families and grandparents, where they were playing a critical role in supporting some of these families. And then very much what we talked about and what we're starting to see as basically schools begin to open their doors, and obviously going back to full capacity in September, is the increased risk of exclusions as children and young people who were already finding schooling a challenge have had such a long period out of school, and how they transition back. Can we just move on to the next slide? Thank you. So we kind of all know these things, but now it's about how we can actually model them. And I think, you know, the lag in demand, as I said, is relatively straightforward. But what will be critical will be trying to model, and it won't be an exact science, but if we could start to build a picture so that we can target resources for some of the mitigating action and start to have those conversations with Section 151 officers about what we think this is potentially going to look like, we will be in a better position. So some of the kind of information that we're looking at and the data that we're looking at to help inform some of this predictive kind of modelling really is is basically what's listed down below. And I'll just kind of go through some of those areas. So interestingly, what we were talking about, the safeguarding issues in adult social care. So working with providers to really assess the numbers and types of packages of support that have been suspended. So we will know about the ones we know about that are basically commissioned by social care, but obviously there are a lot of self-funders or people who have individual service funds or personal budgets, that direct payments that we don't necessarily know about. Working with the local voluntary groups that support informal and young carers to understand some of the key challenges and requests for support that are coming through. So again, we can start to kind of model where some of that kind of real pressure is in the system and how we can work to mitigate and work with our partners to mitigate some of that. Drawing on the wider council and partner data around debt. So obviously, families that are falling into debt, council tax arrears, rental arrears, but also the Universal Plus data. So where health has already had an alert to increase the number of health visiting appointments. So again, we can start to see if there are triggers coming through there. And obviously we've touched on domestic violence and the MARIC data and NEAT data, because we know that young people are going to really struggle if we hit this economic downturn and the loss of jobs, particularly our care leaver population who struggle already. And again, it is about looking at that area and how we can best support and use our resources to best support those young people. Working with schools to identify those children and whether there are communities who have not engaged in distance learning. So again, we can start to kind of like target some of that to understand why they haven't engaged and what the impact of not engaging has been. Working with voluntary groups to gain further insight into the demand and type of demand and requests for support around mental health. So those referrals that would not necessarily come across our door, but we know are building out there. Touching on the school issue, monitoring the rise in number of children and young people requiring an EHCP. Interestingly, one of the local authorities we're working with has actually seen quite a significant rise in EHCP requests during lockdown, which we thought was quite surprising because you would expect with the schools not operating business as usual, but it just shows that maybe some of that is being driven by concerned parents. And again, that is going to be a challenge. And then obviously we touched on monitoring the rise in school exclusions. And what you can't see at the bottom of the screen, as Steve mentioned, is we actually have got a plug here for a survey we put out this week, which we've asked DCSs, because it's specifically around children's, the survey, or one of their team members to complete, to try and answer quite a short survey. So if any of you received it or see it on our LinkedIn or our Facebook pages, please do complete it, to try and build a picture at a national level so that we can really start identifying the pressure points and hopefully start to mitigate some of that. And before we go on to questions, Rob, if that's okay, I really wanted to bring in Colin Foster, DCS at Bedford Borough, because I think it would be really good to hear from you, Colin, about some of the areas that I've touched on that you are absolutely experiencing right at the forefront.
Yeah, great. Please do, Colin. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Maggie. I think it's really important as Director of Children's Services to have be able to have a strong, robust conversation around finances with Terry, Section 151 officers, and with Duncan, Chief Executive, and also how we can then effectively, as officers, present a case to members that makes clear the pressures that we expect, but it's very well researched, and that's why we brought in Peopletoo to work with us to try and, as best we can, forecast that demand. It's quite interesting when you look at when COVID started, there was approximately 2-3% of children in school. Our referrals, contacts, etc., all fell by 30%. There are now 13% of children back and young people back in schools. Our referral rates at the moment are what we would consider normal for this time of year. So just think about that, because the majority of the referrals come from schools. So therefore, from September, there is going to be a curve. The lockdown was to support the NHS and ensure that we could flatten the curve so demand on the NHS wasn't too great. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume there will be a significant curve come in children's services, a curve that could last from 8 to 12 months. The work we did has tried to, as best we can, analyse that curve, and we're looking at an approximate increase in demand in children's social care of around 30% in the autumn. So it is significant. Now, as was mentioned earlier, it's this about financial viability of the council, and how, as a direction, a corporate colleague, can I ensure that we secure financial viability of a council through the lens of children's services, and therefore effective forecasting is of critical importance. So what we've done, based on the Peopletoo report, is we put a package, and as Duncan quite rightly said, if we get prevention right as best we can, then that will help mitigate the demand. And so that package is effectively based on additional resource in prevention and early help services. We're fortunate here in Bedford Borough that over the past 3 years we've managed to reduce demand significantly and also reduce costs whilst improving quality. So we do have a strong basis from which to work from. That investment in prevention, and then extra support door. So everyone's children's social care departments will have their front door a MASH or similar, and that's where the referrals come in. So increased support in the assessment team, where those referrals are assessed, and make sure that the assessment is thorough and detailed within the statutory 45-day period. Then there can be a judgment as to whether that case can step down into the preventative services, or indeed does need to escalate through to social care. I'm not naive enough to think that there won't be any escalation through to social care, because there will. The question is how we mitigate that as best we can, and how we support families, most importantly, to deal with the outcome of COVID and stay together. I think it's sometimes a bit of a myth around children's services that the process is geared towards taking children into care. An effective children's services department enables families to stay together as much as they possibly can, where it is safe to do so. So that is the drive based on the research that we've done. So effectively, for me, if we get this right and we get our demand and forecasting right, we can flatten that curve demand in children's services, and therefore mitigate costs as best we can. But there was a few comments around placements for children, particularly children in care. We have to be realistic. I realise there may be some suppliers on the call. We welcome working with the great providers that we do work with, and we do everything we can to enable them to be effective in their support for children and young people, but also to make sure their business doesn't close. Because the reality of placements at the moment is it is a seller's market. It is not a buyer's market. In some markets, with effectively as local authorities, we can seek to manage the market. This is a seller's market. So if we don't work effectively with providers, then the money will just go up, because more providers will close, the cost will increase, because the demand is tremendously outstripping supply already, and that would continue. So placement cost is a significant. And I'd also add say a really good piece of work done with Maggie and Peopletoo around SEND, because sometimes that could be missed when we talk about the financial envelope within children's services, particularly. Is since the Children and Families Act in 2014, there's been in our case there's been a threefold increase in education healthcare plans, and that's in normal times, before COVID. When you think about it was mentioned, you mentioned earlier around mental health challenges, family breakdown, domestic abuse, etc. The amount of things that children, young people and families are dealing with, really difficult stuff, is going to see that increase. And it's a great concern for us. So yeah, I think that's an overview of where we're at, and I'm very hopeful. At the end of the day, you talk to any director of children's services, you've got to believe that you're going to do something, you're going to do the best, you're going to do something good, and that you're going to help people as best you can. And you have to hold that optimism, because the one thing we can all share at the moment is pressure. We feel under pressure. Conversations with colleagues feels under pressure. Conversations with families are under pressure. It's all about pressure. And so optimism and kindness and compassion, I think, is the factors that will see us through. So I also have a belief that if we do engage early intervention through early help and work on that prevention piece, enable children and young families to develop as best they can by localising finances and working with communities in the best possible way, then we can help limit the spend. But if we don't, the increasing demand will overwhelm children's social care and will will drive significant spend and pressure on local authorities in the future. That's me, Rob. I'm happy to take any.
Colin, thanks very much. And that optimism and compassion really came through without getting teary. Of course, it reminded Dave Hill, your colleague who recently passed away, the DCS from Surrey. You reminded me of the sort of that message that people like Dave and yourself have always given about optimism, compassion, being in this to make a difference. So it came through very strongly.
Thank you, Rob. Dave, I have to say, Dave was a wonderful mentor, and I attended one of his sessions just over 10 years ago now, and I remember every single word. The guy's name's great. So thank you for that.
Remarkable. Remarkable guy. So we've got 10 minutes. So thanks for the speakers for getting through our sessions. Well done. What I'm going to do is ask you, Steve, to give us sort of, a load of comments and questions that have been made, and then I'll take a pass through the panel, and panelists can choose to respond to the questions or comments that they think they'd really like to contribute on. So, Steve, give us plenty of feedback from the people joining us today.
Thanks, Rob, and the panel, and also to all the questions that come in. Sorry if we can't answer all of them, but here's a flavour. I'm going to give you 4 at the moment, and if we have time, we'll come back to some more. Just staying with the children's theme, Colin says, is it worth keeping an eye on applications for free school meals as a proxy indicator for increased poverty? So nodding heads there. Oh, lots of nodding heads there. And then just changing back to adults, Alison says, on older people, how do you suggest we predict demand? Craig says, going back to an earlier topic we were talking about, are you suggesting that social care provision should be taken back centrally relating to COVID-19? And finally, just for this set of questions, Michael asked a general question, which is really on the agenda with us at the Social Care Institute for Excellence. We're doing essays and podcasts about this, and Ewan, who's on the panel here, is writing an article for Home Care Professional magazine, because it's not just about care homes. COVID-19 has raised the profile of adult social care, says Michael. How do we continue to keep this going to get the same attention as the NHS?
No, good set of questions. Thank you very much. I'll be interested to add as well to the panel your commissioning. Is it understood between health and local government what commissioning means? As CIPFA, of course, we have CFOs in the NHS, CFOs in local government. I'm always quite interested to talk about what does commissioning mean. Is it a procurement activity through to, is it a market making activity? Because I think sometimes commissioning can mean different things to different people. But thanks for those questions, Steve. My own one as well. Ewan, let's come back to you. We haven't heard from you for a little while. Your thoughts on any of that you'd like to respond to?
Well, I might pick up on your the question you raised about the difference between commissioning between local authorities and the NHS. I think the NHS certainly hasn't had a track record of doing what we call micro commissioning within their remit. So how do you make services available to people with direct payments, personal budgets? So I think they find it hard to think about commissioning small providers, innovative providers, very often within community settings, because they're not used to dealing at that scale. So local authorities, I think, are much further ahead on supporting the market to support people with personal budgets, direct payments. So that's one big issue. I think the local authorities can teach the NHS quite a lot about community engagement and working with communities to shape commissioning priorities and commissioning intentions. I'm not saying that local authorities are perfect at this, but they are, I think, further ahead, and I think local authorities can teach the NHS a lot about how to do that better. And I'm sure there's lots the NHS can teach local authorities as well. But the closer they get together, of course, that learning will spread between the two organisations. That's why I think local joined up commissioning is the way forward.
Thanks very much. Terry, anything you'd like to come back on from the questions and comments raised so far?
I think just a couple of things really, Rob. The first thing really is the bit about predicting demand. I'd say, well, it can never be perfect, but probably the worst thing in the world to do is not to try. And I think, you should, certainly not give up on it, but even though it's difficult, you should actually try to predict what that demand is, even though it might be wrong, even though you might have to revisit it time and time again, but, you will increase your knowledge by doing that. So I think it is something you should do. I think the social care funding one, somehow, it needs to be sorted out, whether that needs to be funded centrally, but certainly I think the situation where it's taking up an increasingly larger and larger and larger and larger share of councils' budgets can simply not go on, because what happens for the rest of the universal services that councils deliver that are increasingly marginalised, and how do you manage that politically? So I think there's a real issue there that is going to come to a head, either through Section 25 notices, Section 114 notices, or whatever. But I don't think it's going to be held off for too much longer.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Interesting thoughts. Duncan.
Yeah, I think three thoughts came to me, Robert. The first one was, and I'm interpreting the question slightly, about whether social care should go back to some sort of national system. From my perspective, absolutely not. What COVID's demonstrated is that local government has worked incredibly well because it's local. And if you look at all of the issues that have come through on COVID, I would suggest the solutions have all been provided locally by local government, working with partners like the NHS locally and all sorts of people, particularly communities, at that local level to get solutions. So when you start to look at test and trace, local government resolving, when you start to look at all the outbreak management stuff that's now come to us, the shielding program, there's been some really good work done by all sorts of different people across different organisations in the system. But what I would say is, when it's really got sticky and you've needed solid solutions that can deliver across the entire country, people have come to local government to do that, because that's our strength, that we are local. And I think that is the strength that we should be bringing to social care. It neatly leads on to the point about commissioning. From my perspective, yes, we need to get much better joined up commissioning. Entirely agree with you. And we're fortunate to be part of a fantastic integrated care system. We work really well with local NHS providers and organisations really closely. I speak to Chief Executive CCG, the Hospital Trust, and our Community Mental Health Trust probably every week. Within there, we've got a really clear understanding about how we bring commissioning together. What I would say is, at a practical level, my experience is the more under pressure you are for finances, the more you treat commissioning about shaping, controlling markets, the more your finances are in a reasonable place, the more it's about a procurement decision, because you need to get this piece of work done. So there is a difference in where the two organisations come from, despite us wanting to work together. And we need to look more at joint posts, pool budgets, similar shared practice. So absolutely agree with you and about that joining up. The last point I'll just touch on, how do we keep adult social care in the public's imagination as an issue? We should be using that profile. Entirely agree. I don't have the answers, but I would just say I don't think it was by giving it a badge.
Maggie.
Okay, conscious of time, so I'll leave the preschool meal question to Colin, because I know he'll probably want to comment on that. So I'll just pick up on the adults and predicting demand. I will just say quickly on Terry's point, it's a working model. It's got to be a working model. The predictive, it's not going to stand still in this current environment at all. But just in terms of older people, I mean, my view is that actually, I don't think in older people, the numbers will necessarily change, because the demographics are the demographics. I think there will be a delay in presenting, because families will probably want to try and hold on as long as they can. So therefore, by the time they present, needs will be very complex. I think also there will be a shift in the type of services that are required. So a shift from residential to more community-based. But again, how do we manage that so that we don't actually end up with packages of care that exceed the cost of residential care? And this is where a place-based approach, building on our community assets, building on technology, working with our providers to ensure that we can manage that in the community, to deliver the best outcomes, but also value for money as well. So conscious of time, so Colin, do you want to answer the free school meal kind of question?
Colin.
Oh, one of us was always going to say we're on mute. Sorry, it was me. Yeah, I think the question about free school meals is absolutely right. But of course, keep a close eye on the free school meal numbers. But what I would also say is ensure that folk are going out to schools and making sure they're finding families that now will be entitled to free school meals who perhaps weren't before COVID, because identifying those families will help address that future curve, because you can start working with those families sooner.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, thanks very much to all our panelists. What a great lineup you were, and really rich contributions, great questions from everybody. Thank you very much indeed. A few comments
Rob,
from me. Yes.
Can I, sorry to interrupt you, but can I just finish off with good news? I mean, presumably somebody might not have liked it, but Joshua says, as a new trainee accountant, I just wanted to extend my thanks to the panel. It's been really useful to hear about the current and forthcoming financial challenges in the care sector, particularly over COVID-19. Really great insights. So I thought I'd mention that.
Good. Well, thank you very much. No, good interruption to make. We think the best way of arguing for more resources is to always demonstrate that we're making the best possible use of resources at the moment. And so I hope what you'll find from SCIE Peopletoo, CIPFA, is we want to provide practical, real support, help, guidance, ideas, exchange, because the better the job we make of managing resources and outcomes at the moment, actually the stronger our case for why we need more resource. I think my closing comment is, this has been a tough time for the government, and they may very easily look to structural reform because that's what governments tend to do in order to argue that was the problem all along, rather than we got testing wrong or we got PPE wrong or something else. So I don't know what the next 6 months holds for us in terms of what the government will do on policy. Anything is possible. I think in the meantime, heads down and let's try and make the best job we can with what is a flawed system. I think at the end of the day, relying on a property tax to fund these vital services is not sustainable for the medium term, and either local authorities need access to a wider set of taxes or an insurance scheme, or the government has to provide more grant. I don't know where that will land, but clearly that's the medium term problem. In the meantime, I hope today's demonstrated that there's plenty of help, support, advice and exchange of information. My thanks to everybody for joining. My thanks to the panel. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Rob.
So you can sign off now, folks. Thank you very much.
Okay, nice to see you all. Thanks, folks.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.